Good. Yeah. Okay. Then I try to read my paper and then maybe see I can finish it. So as Kim points out, contemporary Confucian studies have been disproportionately focused on the ethical side of the tradition. In this regard, Kim's book makes an enormous contribution to the field of Confucian political thought. And what makes Kim's project even more valuable is that he goes beyond textual analysis of political ideas in Confucian writings, and he tried to build them into a coherent and systematic political theory. So in what follows, I will examine Kim's reconstruction of Confucian political theories of Mencius and Xunzi. However, rather than taking issue with whether Kim's reconstructions are true to the original ideas of Mencius and Xunzi, I intend to accept his version of Confucian political theories as they are. On this assumption, I first investigate whether his conceptual frameworks are effective and appropriate, and then I examine whether his reconstructions have any limitation, and if any, what parts should be complemented. So Kim makes clear that he is not aiming at providing a correct interpretation of the political ideas of Mencius and Xunzi. Rather, Kim's aim is to reconstruct their political insights and ideas in a philosophical, intellectual way, probably to the extent that neither Mencius nor Xunzi could have thought of themselves. So in order to turn their ideas into a systematic political theory, Kim employs 4 conceptual frameworks: negative and positive Confucianism, virtue and ritual constitutionalism, and moral and civic virtue, and strong and tempered virtue monism. First, let's see Kim's negative and positive Confucianism. According to Kim, Confucian virtue politics places supreme importance on the moral character of the ruler. On the one hand, rulers should exert his power to run the government in a way that brings benefit to the people. And on the other hand, the ruler should not exert his power in a way that brings harm to the people. And Kim calls the dimension of enabling the ruler's legitimate power positive Confucianism, and dimension of the constraining the ruler's illegitimate power negative Confucianism. He then argues Mencius' political theory leans toward to negative Confucianism, and Xunzi's political theory leans towards positive Confucianism. However, one should not be mistaken to consider them as 2 opposite systems. As Kim points out, quote, positive Confucianism refers to the aspect of Confucian virtue politics that enables the ruler, properly constrained by the logic of negative Confucianism. Kim seems to be saying that rulers' legitimate power is to be enabled only on the condition that it is properly constrained. So this suggests that Xunzi's positive Confucianism is not a direct opposite of Mencius' negative Confucianism, rather it is based on negative Confucianism. If this is Kim's view, instead of employing a simple negative positive framework, it would have been better for him to pay closer attention to the dynamic and productive interplay between the negative and positive dimensions in the political thought of Mencius and Xunzi. In addition, the framework of negative and positive Confucianism tends to gloss over the differences as well as overemphasize affinities between Mencius and Xunzi. First of all, Kim's point is that we find positive Confucianism in both thinkers in the sense that they do not object to interest per se, but rather they try to redirect the ruler's private interest for the service of the people. Mencius' positive Confucianism encourages the extension of rulers' private interest to the people, transforming it into public interest. However, Xunzi's positive Confucianism depends on the ritual institutions through which the ruler's true interest can be fulfilled along with the interest of the common people. And Kim argues that Xunzi's positive Confucianism is a full realization of the underdeveloped ideal in Mencius' thought. In other words, he considered them as a more of continuum than discrete systems. However, if we look into what is enabled concerning the ruler's interest, there seems to be an asymmetry. For Mencius, it is ruler's transformed interest by morality, but it is ruler's true interest for Xunzi. Are the transformed interest and the true interest of the ruler the same kind? Unfortunately, Kim does not proceed a further discussion on this issue, because Kim's interest lies in finding the common positive dimension in Mencius and Xunzi. And Kim concludes that both of them share the same conviction that benevolent government can be obtained by acknowledging the importance of material interest. If this is the minimal condition for positive Confucianism, yes, Mencius and Xunzi do belong to the same category. However, if we consider what is enabled maximally in their positive vision, I am not so sure whether we can consider Xunzi's positive Confucianism as an articulation of Mencius' implicit view. If this is so, it would be proper to think that they developed their own versions of positive Confucianism. Secondly, concerning the ruler's power, what is constrained in Mencius' negative Confucianism and what is enabled in Xunzi's positive Confucianism do not seem to be that different from in terms of the amount of power available to the ruler. According to Kim, in Mencius' negative Confucianism, the moral power of virtuous ministers counterbalance the political power of the ruler. Through this check and balance between the two ruling powers, the Confucian government is devoted to the well-being of the people. In contrast, in Xunzi's positive Confucianism, ruler's power is not shared with other people. Xunzi's ruler has a paramount constitutional insignificance. However, for Xunzi, the ruler's power is legitimately exercised only in his role for inheriting, maintaining, transmitting the ritual institutions that have been created by the ancient sage kings. Accordingly, we cannot say that the Xunzian ruler enjoyed much more freedom and liberty in his power than the Mencian ruler who is surrounded by virtuous ministers. How much difference there has to be between the enabled power and the constrained power? However, this question is not asked by Kim. In addition, Kim is right in pointing out the primary task of Confucian ministers is to transform the hereditary ruler into a sage king. In this scheme, the task of Confucian minister is not merely counterbalancing the ruler's power, but rather complementing the ruler's virtue. Furthermore, Kim's proposal of the constraining power of the ministers over the ruler seems to be far from the ideal ministership featured in the Book of Document. For example, Shun, Wei, Ian, and the Duke of Zhou are the ones who provided indispensable support to the ruler. Of course, the rulers whom Mencius dealt with in the Warring State period were no sage kings. Nevertheless, if they were surrounded by the virtuous ministers, it implies that they were morally decent enough to recognize and employ virtuous ministers, and they had at least a modicum of interest in paying heed to the moral guidance of ministers. So whichever may have been the case, the countervailing and complementing forces ministers seems to be just the two sides of the same coin. So Kim needs to fill this gap between the ideal ministership as the ruler's collaborator and the non-ideal ministership as the ruler's constraint. So another important conceptual framework that Kim employs is the distinction between moral virtue and civic virtue. And Kim defines, and quote, by moral virtue, I mean a set of character traits that are directly concerned with the human excellence and flourishing. On the other hand, civic virtue is distinguished from the moral virtue as it refers to a set of character traits that are primarily concerned with the creation and sustenance of the political community, and thus only has an indirect relationship with the human excellence and flourishing, end quote. So if moral virtue ultimately contributes human excellence and flourishing, the main function of civic virtue is to bring political order. And Kim distinguishes the Mencius four cardinal virtues belong to moral virtue, whereas what he calls Xunzi's first virtue of correctness, order, peacefulness, and the self-control belong to civic virtue. And however, he makes it clear that this distinction is heuristic because classical Confucians did not distinguish moral and civic virtue. And this point leads to his first conceptual framework of virtue monism, the view that there is no recognizable separation between moral and civic virtue. However, Kim argues that this does not mean that classical Confucians uniformly believed in a seamless continuum between the two. According to Kim, Mencius and Xunzi hold slightly different views, attributing Mencius to strong virtue monism and Xunzi to tempered virtue monism. In his explanation, and quote, strong virtue monism, which I associate more closely with Mencius, stipulates perfect harmony between moral and civic virtue. In strong virtue monism, civic virtue is thought to spontaneously extend from moral virtue, and therefore it holds no independent moral significance. However, tempered virtue monism, which I attribute mainly to Xunzi, views moral and good political consequences in a non-straightforward manner, creating wider room for political agency to maneuver with a view to the public good. Kim's point is that even though both Mencius and Xunziye hold the virtue monistic view, Mencius' focus is more on the continuum, whereas Xunziye pays more attention to the instrumental aspect of virtue in enhancing political order. And as Kim clarifies, these frameworks of civic and moral virtue and strong and tempered virtue monism have a practical value in appreciating differences in Mencius and Xunziye's thought. However productive and efficient these frameworks are, they are a bit worrisome to me because they do not do full justice to the tradition to which they are applied. As Kim acknowledges, moral virtue and civic virtues are not mutually exclusive, and both Mencius and Xunziye adopt virtue monism. Then isn't there a better way to capture this distinctive characteristic of the Confucian tradition? If virtues are truly monistic, then instead of distinguishing them into two different categories, it would have been better to delineate their differences on the spectrum. For example, civic virtues can be considered as a minimum functional virtue to prevent disorder, whereas moral virtue can be considered as a maximum functional virtue to contribute to human excellence. So if we put civic and moral virtue on the spectrum of virtue function, civic virtues are not necessarily short of being full moral virtue, rather civic virtues are the basic and integral parts of the moral virtue. Furthermore, if we adopt the spectrum of view, we can expand and elaborate different functional virtue in a full scale. In reconstructing Xunziye's notion of civic virtue, Kim makes an important observation between civility required in the uncivilized state and civility required in the civil state. In order to escape from the state of nature, we need Xunziye's first virtue, correctness and order, peacefulness and self-control. However, according to Kim, this does not naturally guarantee the political order. In addition to set of the first virtue, we need what Kim calls the Confucian principle of civility in the civil state. End quote. First, the moral conflict between the gentleman and pettyman should be resolved neither by forceful imposition of truth nor humiliating speech, but by means of respectful and tolerant moral persuasion. And second, that for moral persuasion to happen, even the pettyman should be acknowledged as a partners of the civil conversation, end quote. So this Confucian civility can be called Xunziye's second virtue, and similar to Xunziye's first virtue, Kim argues that Confucian civilities are primarily concerned with the social order, and their connections to human flourishing is not straightforward. However, given that Confucians believe that human beings cannot flourish outside human relationship or community, I think Confucian civilities cannot be omitted for a flourishing human life. Therefore, Confucian civilities should be integral parts of moral virtue. So what is missing in Kim's account is the point that full moral virtues do not just contribute to the flourishing of individual, but also to the flourishing of a society. Importantly, in Confucianism, human flourishing is a flourishing within the community and flourishing with other people. The virtuous person is none other than the ones who help others and who help community morally and materially thrive. And isn't this the very telos of Confucian virtue politics, as Kim argues? So I think if we put Kim's account of virtue in spectrum rather than different categories of virtues, then it will be more advantageous. First, because this is true to the Confucian virtue monism, and second, because this encapsulates the characteristics of Confucian virtues and the conception of Confucian flourishing in a more accurate way. So, and the final part, then let's move to what can be complemented in Kim's reconstruction. The first is a description of the ideal political community, and second is the status of the people. In the text of the Mencius and Xunziye, we do not find a specific vision of utopia as we find in chapter 80 of the Lao Tzu. Nevertheless, I'm still curious exactly where the two Confucian political theories aim to reach in the end. As Kim points out, the telos of Confucian virtue politics is the material and moral well-being of the people, so this must be the destination that Mencius and Xunziye intend to reach. However, what do they mean by the moral well-being of the people? As Kim points out, despite their consensus on the moral perfectibility of human beings, both Mencius and Xunziye did not make an impossible demand that all members of the society to be perfectly virtuous like sage. So if their goal is not to make the people all sage, what would be the exact goal of a state-centered moral education? Does Mencius try to turn the people into filial children, and does Xunziye try to turn them into good citizens? In the same vein, what do they mean by the material well-being of the people? Would Mencius be satisfied if benevolent government is able to provide the people with the basic necessities? Is this also the case for Xunziye? Despite their shared conviction on the positive function of material interest, it is Xunziye who places much more active role in material interest. So I think if Kim can provide a detailed description of their respective ideal political community, that would be a great addition to Kim's project. In relation to their ideal visions, another question that should be asked is, who are the people? The ultimate purpose of Confucian virtue politics. In Kim's book, we easily notice an uneven treatment of people in the sections concerning Mencius and Xunziye. The sections on Mencius heavily focuses on the ruler and the ministers, whereas the sections on the Xunziye focusing on the ruler and the people. This asymmetry must be reflection of the original ideas of Mencius and Xunziye, but Kim does not delve deeper into this chasm between the two. And yet, his discussion on the people's right to rebellion hints at the dissimilar treatment of people in Mencius and Xunziye. So according to Kim's analysis of the doctrine of revolution, there are three bodies of people: the ruler, the active subject, and the passive subject. So the ruler is a political agent who ascends the throne by hereditary right. An active subject, so-called heaven-appointed officers, are morally excellent people from the noble families, and they have the right to rebellion. And passive subjects are the lay people, and they do not have right to rebellion. And if we combine this account of political bodies with Mencius' general political theory, we come up with the three bodies of people: the ruler, virtuous ministers, and the people in the Mencius. And Kim explains that with the changing notion of the mandate of heaven from the political sanction to the moral mission in the Mencius, political liberty is available to everyone who is capable of moral self-cultivation. I think this is right, given Mencius' claim that human nature is good. However, we should also keep in mind Mencius' another claim on the division of labor. The great men labor with their minds, and the small men labor with their physical strength. Those who labor with their minds govern others. Those who labor with their physical strength are governed by others. In other words, as much as those who are capable of moral cultivation do have political liberty, those who cannot cultivate themselves do not have political liberty. Hence, the common people do not seem to have political liberty as well as a right to rebellion. That being so, the people are just the beneficiaries of the benevolent government in Mencius' view. On the other hand, Xunziye's emphasis on the ritual institutions had a curious consequence, inducing different groups of political agents, that is, the ruler and the people. In Xunziye's theory, the ruler has supreme significance as the opposition to disorder. Accordingly, Xunziye underscores the indivisibility and stability of the ruler's power. And as Kim observes, this must be the reason for Xunziye's silence on ministership and the mandate of heaven. At the same time, people seem to have a political agency, and Kim argues that even though people do not have an explicit right to rebellion, their status has certainly changed in the Xunziye. In Kim notes, unlike the Mencius, for Xunziye, people are not mere thermometers or gauges that only passively indicate the success of the government. Furthermore, Kim suggests that people can probably overturn the ruler if we consider the analogy employed by Xunziye. The load is the boat, and the common people are the water, and water can support the boat, but water can also overturn the boat. And I think Justin will point out later, and I'm not also sure about whether Xunziye actually believes that people can rebel against a ruler, but I do think Xunziye has a far more positive view of political agency of the people than Mencius. So this must be natural because people are the very constituent of political order. Without them, there can be no order. So therefore, if Kim goes back to this question of the people in the Mencius and Xunzi, he will be able to provide a more vivid answer to the question I just raised. What do they mean by the material and moral well-being of the people? And a comprehensive account of political status of people, which is already scattered throughout his book, would further advance our understanding of Confucian political theory. So although I raised several questions and suggestions here, I think Kim's project makes an enormous achievement in theorizing the intricate political thoughts of Mencius and Xunzi, and I believe this project will provide a firm ground for future research for Kim himself, as well as for many others who are interested in Confucian political thought. Thank you.